In the frozen winter of 1944, when Europe was breaking under the weight of a war that seemed endless, 3 German nurses found themselves fighting a battle they had never chosen. Elsa, Maria, and Greta had spent months in a small, makeshift field hospital stitched together inside an abandoned school building. Their uniforms were torn and stiff with dried blood. The air smelled of medicine and smoke, and their hearts carried the crushing heaviness of watching life slip through their fingers every single day. They had no weapons, no strategy, no ambition for glory. Their only mission was to keep wounded soldiers alive in a world where everything was dying. The night everything changed was colder than usual. The sky was unnaturally quiet until a sudden roar split the air. The ground trembled. The walls of the hospital shook as artillery shells landed dangerously close. Windows shattered, and darkness swallowed the rooms in seconds. Before the nurses or the few surviving doctors could understand what was happening, heavily armed soldiers stormed inside. They grabbed everyone: wounded soldiers, medical staff, civilians hiding under tables. No explanations, no mercy. Elsa remembered a gun pressed against her back as she was shoved outside into the blinding white snow. Maria stumbling behind her, Greta crying into her sleeve to keep her fear from showing. They were dragged through a storm of ice and wind to a remote prisoner of war camp tucked deep into a forest that looked dead under layers of frost. The gates creaked open like the jaws of something ancient and unforgiving. Once inside, the 3 nurses were separated into small, dark concrete rooms with cracked walls, broken cots, no blankets, and iron bars that let the cold pour in without resistance. They were treated not as healers but as suspects, as threats, as if their hands, which had held nothing but bandages and hope, were weapons the world should fear. Days inside the camp were a relentless repetition of punishment disguised as routine. They were woken before dawn, forced outside without warm clothing, ordered to stand in the snow for hours with their heads down while icy winds cut across their skin like knives. Their hands went numb, their fingers swelled, their lips turned blue. Breakfast was often nothing more than a thin slice of stale bread. Sometimes the guards withheld even that. Their water rations were so small that Greta would often whisper at night that she could feel her throat burning from dryness. No one listened. No one cared. The interrogations were the harshest part. Each nurse, taken one at a time into a dim room lit by a single flickering bulb, was questioned for hours. They were asked again and again who they worked for, what secret messages they sent, what German units they supported. Their answers never changed. They were nurses, nothing more. They treated whoever was brought to them. They knew nothing of codes or strategies. But the interrogators demanded confessions, not truth. When they didn't receive any, the nurses were forced to stand for long, painful hours without moving, or were locked in suffocating storage rooms so cold they could see their breath hanging in the air. Sometimes water was thrown at them so the frost would cling to their clothes, making their bodies shake uncontrollably. It was punishment without explanation, cruelty without reason. One night, the guards ordered all prisoners outside to clear snow from the campgrounds. Elsa's hands shook so violently she could barely grip the shovel. Maria collapsed once, her legs giving out beneath her. But the guards barked at her until she struggled back onto her feet with tears freezing on her cheeks. The silence among prisoners was suffocating. No one dared to help her. Even kindness had become dangerous. Despite everything, the nurses held on to the one thing the camp could not take away: their humanity. Elsa proved this one day when a severely wounded prisoner was dragged into the infirmary, barely breathing, burning with fever. The guards warned her that any suspicious behavior would be punished, but Elsa knelt beside the man with the same compassion she once offered in the field hospital. She cleaned his wounds, cooled his fever with damp cloth scraps, and even gave him half of her bread ration. Against all odds, he survived. The guards could not understand how this woman, whom they had treated so brutally, still had the strength to save a life. But cruelty does not understand compassion, just as war does not understand healing. Months passed, and time inside the camp lost meaning. Days blended together in an endless rhythm of pain, labor, interrogation, and frozen nights spent clinging to threads of hope. The 3 nurses only saw each other in fleeting moments, quick glances during roll call, or in the dark corners of the barracks where they whispered memories of home, trying to hold on to the person they used to be before war stripped everything away. Sometimes Elsa would whisper, "We were never the enemy," and Maria, with broken resignation, would answer, "But war needed someone to blame." Then one morning, everything changed. Gunfire sounded in the distance. The air filled with frantic shouting as soldiers ran across the camp. Footsteps thundered. Something felt different, chaotic, unpredictable. And then, without warning, the iron gates were opened. A single officer stepped forward, looked at the prisoners, and spoke with a strange calmness. "You're free. No explanation. No apology. Just the sudden release of hundreds of people who had forgotten what freedom felt like." Elsa stepped into the open world with a breath she didn't know she'd been holding for months. The snow outside looked different, almost peaceful, as if it belonged to a world untouched by the horrors behind those gates. She whispered softly to herself and the others beside her, "We will return to the life we were meant to live." When the three nurses walked away from the camp, they turned back one last time. The barbed wires, the cold rooms, the harsh guards, the endless suffering all stood behind them like a dark shadow that would follow them for the rest of their lives. The camp had taken their strength, their comfort, and their identity, but it had failed to take their humanity. And that was their quiet victory. Years later, Elsa wrote in her diary, "War imprisoned us, humiliated us, and tried to break us. But it did not change who we were. We were nurses. We healed even when we were hurting. We saved lives even when we were struggling to save our own." They call what happened to us cruelty. We call it survival. And what we survived made us unbreakable. Their story is not just a tale of three women lost in the machinery of war. It is a reminder that even in the darkest corners of history, there were people whose courage came not from violence but from compassion. Not from power but from endurance. Not from victory but from the simple act of staying human in a time when the world forgot what humanity meant.